Good to see you, bro. Yeah, so this is going to be exciting here.
I hope so. We'll see.
It will be.
All right.
You're going to have
I brought some props. We'll see if I get to them today. If not, we'll get to them next Sunday.
Okay.
Of Egypt and Israel and things like that. It's just things that as a Christian growing up, reading about Egypt and then later Israel in the Bible, when you finally see these things, it sparked some new insights for me, things I'd never thought about before. So we're going to start with Egypt, but let me tell you, Egypt is insanely complicated. And I don't understand it. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a historian. So you may have a lot of questions like, hey, what about this and what about that? And I don't know the answers to that. I don't. And that's why my alternate title for this is Egypt by a Dummy, all right? Because I don't know the answers to those things. These are simply things that I pulled out of the trip that made me go, oh, okay? And we're going to talk about this for the handout. I'm going to reference this in a minute. This is a very simplified timeline of what we think Egyptian history was like and how it overlaps with the Israelites and some things I'm going to refer to in this. And I handled this out because personally, as I go through these things, sorry, I'm still getting over a cold 3 weeks later. It just helps me to have a reference, like, okay, when was that and when was this? Okay, so before we begin then, we'll have a prayer to start Bible class, and I'll ask Kenny if he would to go ahead and open us with prayer.
Father, thank you for this first day of the week that we can come together, study the Bible, learn more about it, and remember Christ died for our sins, and remember this day is about remembering Him, as every day is, but especially that we can have communion and remember Christ through the communion in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, Kenny. So the idea here is to do about half the slides on Egypt this week, half the slides next week, and then spend 2 weeks on my trip to Israel. Okay, so we'll start. Some things these are just some basic ideas to help us understand the context when we read about the Exodus and things like that. So here you see Egypt. It's really divided into what's called Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, but it's confusing because it's based on elevation, not what we would think of as north and south, right? You usually think of something up top being upper and something down below being lower. But this is the Nile River, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. You see the Nile River goes through the desert here, and so it flows down. So that's why this is Upper Egypt and this is Lower Egypt down here. And another thing to think about is that we're going to talk about in just a minute is you can see from that slide why the Nile is so important to Egypt, right? There's desert all around them. So the Nile River is what allowed Egypt to become a great and powerful kingdom. That's their only source of water. And that's also what allowed them to become a great nation is because they were surrounded by desert. And that allowed them to grow up and become powerful without being attacked by enemies, right? Because look at this. There's desert all around them, right? And so they could then thrive as a civilization without having to worry about being attacked. So it was that protection that allowed them to grow up to be a great civilization. And we're going to come back to this, but I want you to notice up here in the top, that's the land of Goshen. And that's where the Israelites lived before when they were slaves. That's going to come up later as we talk about it, but I want you to notice that that's in the Nile Valley, the fertile area right there where all the water came out and spread out and all the sediment came from the Nile. And so it was an incredibly fertile area. All right. Oops, wait. I hit the wrong button. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do is look at some scriptures also. But this is something called a nilometer. Now, this was built much later. This was built by the Romans. But this is how they determined taxes in ancient Egypt, at least during the Roman era. Because what they would do is, the more the Nile flooded, the richer the crops were going to be, the more crops you could grow. And so they would actually measure the water in these nilometers and then determine what your taxes were going to be based on how high the water was. And so that's just an example of why the Nile was so important to Egypt. It was literally the lifeblood of the nation. And so if we let's go to Exodus 7 and verse 20. And boy, my voice is already given out here, guys. And so you're going to have to help me with reading out. And so let's just read about the first plague. Someone just read, let's say 20 through 21. Exodus 7, 20 through 21.
Moses and Aaron did so as Yahweh commanded, and he lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The fish that were in the river died, the river became foul, the Egyptians couldn't drink water from the river, the blood was throughout all the land of Egypt.
Okay, so when he struck the Nile River and turned its waters into blood, you understand that was different than just going out to a river somewhere or going out to a lake and turning. That would have been a miracle enough as it is, right? But when he struck the waters of the Nile as the first plague, that would have had a shocking event to the Egyptians, because in that sense, figuratively speaking, the Nile was the lifeblood of their nation. And so that was showing God's power over the very basic of the very basis of their civilization. Now, I'm going to read a couple of other verses here and talk about that just a little bit more, because it's more even than that. Let's read Exodus 2 and verse 23.
Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of... Am I reading the wrong one?
Yeah, that's right.
Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage.
And I tell you what, read verse 24 as well.
So God heard their groaning, And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob.
Okay, so who did they call out to? God, but what's different about this word God here? It's not the word for Jehovah. We just read about how Jehovah commanded Moses to strike the waters. But they were in Egypt, a land of many, many gods. So it's pointed out to me here, they didn't yet know God as Jehovah God, as Yahweh. Later, God would reveal himself to Moses as Yahweh, Jehovah God. But here they were just crying out to God. And maybe they were even crying out to some of the gods of Egypt. Who knows, right? They had been in Egypt a long time, and they may not have fully understood who Yahweh, Jehovah God, was. In fact, let's go then to Exodus 12:12. Exodus 12:12. And this is, of course, here we're now to the last plague, okay? The very last plague. And here God is giving instructions to Moses. Somebody read Exodus 12:12, please.
For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord.
Against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. So the 10 plagues were not just God showing his power over nature. They were specifically God also showing his power over the Egyptian gods. So, for example, the Nile was thought to be the blood of the god Osiris. So when Moses turned the Nile into blood, how the Egyptians understood that is Yahweh, Jehovah God, has the power over the blood of our god Osiris. And as a matter of fact, if you look at all 10 plagues, and I'll get you just in a second, we could do a whole study on looking at all 10 plagues and seeing which Egyptian gods they corresponded to. Yeah, Luke.
Yeah, there's a lot of false narratives out about Egyptians concerning like when the Bible was written, because the Bible was written during this time.
Right.
And the
right.
Egyptians, some of our found scrolls, as far as predating the Bible, all come from Egypt. This was the heart of the civilization.
Right.
This was the big civilization.
Right.
So to add to your point, God knew that, and he was
Right.
going to show them.
Mm-hmm.
And he's still showing them to this day.
Correct.
And every time somebody comes out with a false narrative saying, oh, well, this scroll predates the Bible, so that must mean something about the Bible.
Right.
But that's not true. We have this account here that's more powerful than anything that's ever been brought up.
Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that. That's kind of a good precursor to some of the things we're going to talk about. So yeah, thanks for that, Luke. But someone brought out the point, I was reading a commentary on this, and someone brought out the point that God was not just convincing the Egyptians that he was God. He was also convincing the Israelites that he was God. Because remember, they had been in bondage for 400 years. And they didn't know Jehovah God. They knew there was a God, and they cried out to a God, but they didn't know Jehovah God. So God here, Jehovah God, is proving not only to the Egyptians that he's the one true God, he's proving to Israel that he's the one true God. And so when we see these stories about, Moses turned the water of the Nile to blood, that's pretty amazing in and of itself. But when you put it in the context of this represented the blood of the Egyptian god Osiris, and now you see there's all this play of words that Moses is showing that the true God has control even of that so-called God's blood. Yeah, go ahead.
Took the words right out of my mouth, and that's the word context. And it has to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's connecting this story way back to that story with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you had me read that verse in Exodus 2. I think it was verse 24. And like you said, the reason why God used Moses and used Aaron was to tell the Israelites, this is who God is. He's the God that spoke to your ancestor. I was thinking of the word progenitor or whatever, but your ancestor, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he didn't need it. Moses or Aaron to do these miracles, but he used them rather to put everything back into the context of the story.
Right, exactly, to tie it all together. Yeah. Very good, very good. And that's all I'm really talking about in this, is giving us context, okay? Some things that I saw that helped me put the bigger story into context. And it also goes to show that, you can't get away from taxes. Even the Romans were like, okay, how much money are you going to pay? We've always paid taxes. Okay, then we took this cruise along the Nile, and it's very interesting to see. This is how people live along the Nile today. And as they were pointing out, it's not that different, than maybe they would have lived a long time ago. It's very, very poor country. And that's the kind of you see people just, walking along with their animals and harvesting vegetation stuff and fishing in the Nile. So it's a very poor country, and maybe it wouldn't have looked too much different a couple of thousand years ago. Okay, now, this is this chronology. I know you can't read it. Don't worry. And the only reason it's up there is to show you how complex it is, and that's why I gave you this simplified chronology. And I hope maybe you'll just kind of look at it as we talk about some of these things. And in retrospect, now that I look at it, I should have put a few more references to biblical things. I do have the Exodus on there and things like that, and when Abraham was born. And of course, some of that you take with a grain of salt. When we say, oh, Abraham was born in 1950 BC, of course, no one knows for sure, but that's the general time frame. It just gives us an idea of thinking about it, okay? Just to kind of put these things in context again. All right, so this is the oldest stone building known on Earth, the oldest building. It's the Saqqara, the step pyramid, that was probably built almost about 4,500 years ago is what they're thinking. And it's still standing to this day. But what I want you to notice is, notice it's in these steps, right? This didn't have that, what we think of as a pyramid shape. This is the earliest known pyramid. And one of the things that I realized in visiting Egypt is that they didn't just start out building these pyramids like this, right? This is the earliest one. It's in these steps. Then there's other pyramids. It's called the Bent Pyramid, and we didn't visit it, so I don't have a picture of it, but it's all weird looking. It's like if a child tried to build a pyramid, and it came out all strange looking. There's also a collapsed pyramid where they tried to build a pyramid and it fell apart. So what all that tells me is that these people learned how to build pyramids. They didn't just know how to do it, right? So when you hear all this crazy stuff on TV about, well, aliens taught them how to build pyramids, it was aliens. Well, that's just foolishness. There's evidence that these people didn't know what they were doing, and it took them time to learn. It took them a couple of thousand years to get it right. So all this craziness you hear on TV about, ancient aliens and we couldn't have done it without aliens, that's just foolishness. You can tell these people had to learn how to build pyramids. So if aliens did teach them, they were really stupid aliens, right? So just forget all that foolishness. It's just plain and apparent that this was all done by humans. Okay. So that's what I learned from that. Okay, and I'm also going to throw this map up here to show you where things are, because we're going to kind of go to the south here, but going up in elevation. But I want to notice one thing, and I should have shown it on the first map. What you're going to see on this side, on the east side, these are where the temples are. On the west side is where the burial sites are. So these are the pyramids over here. These are the temples. So on the east side, with the rising of the sun, is where the temples are. And on the west side, with the setting of the sun, that's where the burials and the pyramids and things like that are. Okay, so that's just an interesting fact, just to kind of orient you to Egypt. All right. Okay, so just to give you an idea here, so here, when Jacob enters Israel, right, when Joseph invites the family in, they enter Egypt about 1870 BC. So I want you to think about it. This building, Saqqara, had already been standing for about 800 years. That's how old this civilization was and how advanced it was. It had already been there for 800 years. So that's a little hard to believe. So I want you to think of the civilization of Egypt. It was already very, very advanced and very well established. And so Jacob, of course, at this time, Israel, what did they do for a living?
They were shepherds.
They were shepherds who lived in what? Tents. They were nomads who just looked around, for places to shepherd their sheep. So you can see the difference in these civilizations. It's hard for us to comprehend it, right? A civilization way up here that's capable of building these buildings like this that we still don't understand how they did it, versus what we would think of as sort of the lowest, shepherds who live in tents, just wandering around trying to feed their flocks. The difference is almost unimaginable to us today, I think.
And Michael, there's a
Yes.
verse at the end of Genesis that said the Egyptians didn't want to have much to do with the Israelites because they were shepherds.
Exactly. And I was going to look that verse up and put it in here, and I forgot. So thank you for bringing that up. That's exactly right. They despised them because, think about it. I don't know, what kind of work would we despise today, look down on, right? They probably smell bad, right? And so they probably look down on it.
Yeah, the Egyptians were very clean people too. They
Exactly.
shave and they prided themselves in all that.
The Egyptians were very clean. They actually would shave their heads, and they wore wigs because of lice. They didn't like the bugs on them and things like that. They also wore makeup to protect their skin. So they were a very advanced civilization. So I just took this picture to show you. This was at Saqqara. These are policemen on camels. And now there's going to be a camel theme through this. And at the end, we're going to talk about camels because it does have something to do with the Bible. But I just saw a lot of camels in Egypt, and so it got me thinking about camels. And so we'll come back to that. I'm just showing you now that that's a great way. I think it'd be awesome to be a policeman who rode a camel. Okay, so here are the Great Pyramids, right? And I'm showing you to see that they're all sort of, how they're located to each other. Back in the back, I know it looks like the smallest, but that's the biggest one. That's the Great Pyramid, built by that guy named Khufu. Then his son built the other pyramid, Khafre Pyramid, and the Menkaure Pyramid, it was his grandson. So they're all related to each other. And later we're going to see building pyramids went out of style, and they buried people in what's called the Valley of the Kings, and we'll talk about that later. But I just want you to notice, because these are the pyramids everyone thinks about, right? These are the big pyramids. So the oldest one, about 2,550 BC, so about 4,500 years ago. Okay, but I want you to think about Moses. Moses was probably, and I don't know who came up with the exact year of 1526 BC, but somewhere in there, right? But my point is, if Moses was born about 1526 BC, these pyramids had been standing for 1,000 years when Moses was born. That's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? Did you ever put that in context? Moses was born, and while these people were slaves in Egypt, and these pyramids had already been around for 1,000 years. So again, the idea of the difference in the civilizations. You're going to have a slave people who are shepherds and the pinnacle of a civilization. And that's where they are. Believe it or not, they're right outside of Cairo. The pyramids are, I don't know if you can tell in the background. You can be in downtown Cairo and see the pyramids. I always thought they were way out in the middle of nowhere. They're not. They're like right outside of Cairo. You can see them from the hotel, right? So I just thought that was interesting too. But anyway, what I want to say now is, okay, so this is just a couple of views of the pyramid. And I'm going to tell you, this is some history stuff, but it's going to come into play in just a minute. This is look at the base of one of the pyramids. Look at that little boy standing on one of those stones. Each one of those stones weighs about 5,000 pounds. Even one of the pyramids has over 2 million stones in it. That's just one of the pyramids. They carved all those things by hand, they moved them by hand, and they stacked them up by hand. So the amount of effort in the engineering and the intelligence, and later we're going to read about, remember Moses was educated in all the ways of the Egyptians, right? He had a really good education because we still can't figure out exactly, we have some rough ideas, but exactly how they did this. This was incredible feat. And it's already been around for 1,000 years. Now I want you to notice also, this is important. Right down here, this is a limestone slab. And so you don't see that on the rest of the pyramid, but see how it's sloped and it's white? The entire side of all the pyramids were covered in white limestone. And so this is looking up the Khafre pyramid. That's just looking up the side to see how steep it is. In addition to that, that would have been covered in white limestone. So it wasn't blocks like this. These things were gleaming white. And in addition to that, this is an artist's rendering, the Great Pyramid was capped with gold. All right? So I want you to understand, this is what the pyramids look like. Not these rough stone things, these huge white things that have been standing for 1,000 years. Now, I want you to imagine that you're a pharaoh, right? You are king over Egypt. And more than that, you're not just a king, you are worshipped as a living God. You are seen as the hand or the incarnation of Ra, the sun. Okay? You're the sun, you are the sun king, basically. You're ruling over a place like this. This still inspires awe, right? In us today, you look at that and you go, wow. Imagine how it looked back then. And imagine you're a shepherd who wanders in out of the desert and you live in a tent and you're seeing something like that. The overwhelming nature of that is hard to even express. But now imagine, okay, you're the Pharaoh. I just want you to imagine this, right? And you've been told your whole life you are a living God. And this shepherd walks up to you and says, hey, I represent the slaves who have been here slaves for 400 years. And I know we're only shepherds, but my God says, the God of these slaves says to you, Pharaoh, you better let my people go, or you are going to regret it. And remember, this guy is so timid, he's not even speaking. He's whispering stuff to his brother, and then his brother Aaron is speaking for him, right? Now, you're Pharaoh. What would your reaction be to that shepherd?
You point to his pyramid.
Exactly. He would go like, I'm sorry, what? Now, you're telling me I'm a living God. Look what we have accomplished. Look at these pyramids. You're a bunch of slaves who live in tents, or at least crude stone houses probably at this point. But nevertheless, because they had doorposts, right? But nevertheless, you can imagine, he would say, what? Your God, Yahweh, is greater than my gods, the God of Egypt? They're greater than me? And so, to get the idea of that, how incredible that would have been. So do you think Pharaoh maybe had a little bit of pride? Right? And so when he said to him, let my people go, who would have done that? If I was Pharaoh, I would have said, yeah, right, okay. And so you can understand why it took these series of plagues and why it maybe took 10 of them. And some of them are pretty awful, right? Some of them are really awful. Why his heart was hardened and why it was maybe so hard for him to let the people go. And like I said, we could talk a whole thing on just, why the plagues impacted the Egyptian religion. But just to say the last couple of plagues, darkness, that showed that God was over the sun god Ra, their principal god. And of course, the death of the firstborn, that even the Pharaoh, the living God, could not protect his own children, right? And so that showed how great Yahweh was. And again, it was also to convince the children of Israel how great Yahweh was to increase their faith. Okay, and any thoughts in here? People, please jump in. I know I'm just talking blah, blah, blah. The other thing I learned, and just as an aside, there are a lot of pyramids in Egypt. There's over 100. I thought there were like 3, right? The big 3. But there's a lot of these little ones you can see out in the countryside. And those would have been from minor officials. Yeah.
What was the significance of the shape of the pyramid? Did it have to do with astrology, astronomy?
Did I not say it was an energy beacon for aliens? The funnel energy down. I don't know.
Is that all in the dummy category?
Yes, yeah. So there are amazing. All I know is, there are certainly amazing things. The way the pyramids are aligned to cardinal points, on the compass and things like that. But I do not know more than that. But that would be a good thing to read about. So
There's still passages inside, though, right?
yeah, there are passages they still haven't gotten into. There are still passages inside the Great Pyramid. They know they're there, but they haven't seen inside them yet. I do know that. Okay, so I don't know any more. Don't ask me any more about pyramids. Okay, so this is the Great Sphinx, and again, this is a little bit of side history, just because I thought it was interesting, and maybe you will too. It was built by the Khafre, one of the sons. And what I thought was interesting about the Sphinx is, I don't know if you can tell, this is a little, the lights are a little bright, but it was painted in bright colors. You can see just a few colors on the side there. It was painted with reds and yellows and probably blues and things like that. So you think of Egypt as everything's just this dull, everything's the color of sand, right? That would not have been the case. You would have these gleaming white pyramids and this giant multicolored Sphinx out front. And so, again, it would have been very visually stunning. We tend to think everybody in the past lived in black and white or everything was sand colored. That's not true. Everything was very brightly colored.
Yeah.
So it changes if you're thinking about Moses walking around there, don't think of it as this drab, boring place, but brightly colored, okay? And then I like to show this because this is the rear end of the Sphinx. I never knew the rear end had a Sphinx, but it does. See, there's its tail. It's a lion. And I just thought, well, who else wouldn't want to see that? Yeah.
So recently, I heard this is pretty funny. When Napoleon came in to conquer a lot of this area, he claimed that he shot the nose off of the Sphinx with a cannon.
Right.
And so recently, though, they said, well, the nose had been falling off a long time before that. So it was just this really crazy rumor.
Exactly.
About recently.
Yeah, exactly. And who knows if that's true or not. Yeah, but I had heard that too. Yeah. Anyway, so these were some Arab tourists. And I throw this in there just to show, here are these ladies dressed in their burqas. Some are completely covered except for their eyes. Some have their faces showing. But I show that to say that the people who live in Egypt now are Arabs. They are not the descendants of the original Egyptians. That race is gone. So the people who live there now, they're Arabian, and they might want you to think that it was their ancestors who built the pyramids, but it was not. That Egyptian race is gone now. And so don't think that the people who live in Egypt today had anything to do with the Egyptian culture, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. They don't. They don't. That's an entirely different race of people that's gone. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. This is downtown Cairo. I think one of the most important reasons people should travel is to understand how blessed we are to live in the United States. We have wealth that is unimaginable in the history of the world. And this is downtown Cairo, and I tell you, some of these things look like mud brick buildings, from the freeway. I don't know what they're made of, but that's what it looked like. And I stopped this particular picture. We were on the bus, and it made me realize something that I'm sitting on this air-conditioned bus, in traffic, and I looked down beside me. Now, this is a major freeway, so this is like I-95, right? So if you can imagine being in Jacksonville in rush hour traffic, and there's cars everywhere, but it's a major freeway, right? Sitting between, the concrete barrier and the side of the road was a woman. And she was probably, maybe in her 30s. And she was sitting cross-legged. And in front of her, she had laid out a little cloth. And on this cloth, she had things like cigarettes and chewing gum and little trinkets. That was her job. To sit by the freeway in rush hour traffic and hope people would buy little trinkets from her. And as I was sitting down looking at my air-conditioned bus in my comfortable seat, and she was sitting cross-legged directly on the pavement, and I was looking down at her, she looked up at me, and she gave me the brightest, most beautiful smile. And I thought, man, if you can be happy and show kindness and smile at somebody while your job is sitting next to a busy freeway, sitting on the asphalt selling trinkets, who am I to ever complain about my life? We have such blessings in the United States, and we do not realize it. But if those of you who have been in the military, if you've ever traveled, if you have seen and I know Art's been to India, and you could probably tell us about the poverty you saw there, it just seeing things like that made me realize, dear God, shut my mouth if I ever complain about my life. How blessed we are in this country. And so it was just things like that. That sort of indirect thing that just made me realize how incredibly blessed we are to live in the United States. So I don't know, Art, do you have any examples for your trip to India?
Yeah, but it's a
whole other thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so it just reminded me how lucky we are. All right, this is the Quran. We took a taxi ride, and so I asked the guy who was driving. He had in the middle of his taxi, that's a Quran. He had the Quran sitting in the middle of his taxi. And that's his actual book. I asked him, I opened it up and took a picture of it. And the reason I want people to understand this is these people, these Muslims, they take their religion very seriously. And it's hard for us in the secular world. Maybe we understand it. I mean, we're here this morning at Bible class, right? The fact that you're here alone puts you way above most Americans, even though we're considered to be a Christian nation. But one of the weird things I noticed is there were a lot of Muslim men who had this spot in the middle of their forehead. Okay, I know the Hindus do the little spot as the third eye, and I know Catholics during Lent, get the ashes on their forehead. But I was like, why do these Muslim men have a spot in the middle of their forehead? Anybody want to guess why? It's a callus from bowing down to prayer 5 times a day and touching your forehead to the rug. They have calluses on their forehead because they're such faithful prayers. I don't have calluses on my knees because I pray all that much. And I thought, man, if that is not an indication of how... Now granted, we might say, but the Bible talks about the vain prayers, of vain repetition of prayers. And that probably falls into that category. But nevertheless, it shows the religious devotion of these people. So when we think about people, they disrespected Muhammad, and these people get really upset about that. Well, you know what? Maybe if we really believed in the God of the Bible, in Jesus Christ, we would be outraged when people disrespect Jesus Christ. When people make fun of Jesus Christ and draw funny little cartoons and dress up as Halloween as Jesus Christ. Oh, isn't that cute? No, it's not. It's blasphemy. And the Muslims understand that, right? Because they take their religion seriously. We don't so much in this country. We don't. We call ourselves a Christian nation, but that's why maybe it's hard for Americans to understand how they react, right? Because they take it seriously, and we in our nation, unfortunately, have kind of dropped that. Okay. So again, just some interesting things. Now, this, after they stopped building pyramids, and we stop at 10:45, right? We got about 5 minutes. So they started burying people in something called the Valley of the Kings. And they think they chose this area because, see that mountain that looks like a pyramid? And this is one of the reasons they think they started burying the pharaohs in this area. And that's way down here. The pyramids were up top. This is way down south. Okay, and so just to give you an idea, this is what the tombs look like for the pharaohs. They were actually dug into the hills, directly into the hills. And I want to notice, this is Tutankhamun. You've already heard of him, right? Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun was not found in a pyramid. He was found here in the Valley of the Kings, in one of these tombs, just dug into the side of the hill. And what I want to mention about him, because we're going to talk about Moses again in a minute, is that he was a minor king, right? He was a minor pharaoh. He was very young. He only ruled just a few years. And yet, in that one tomb, they found over 5,000 objects of gold. And by the way, that's his death mask. You know, a few years ago, do you remember the Treasures of Tutankhamun toured the United States? I don't know if you remember that. But they had his death mask. It was a fake. The real one never left Egypt. Yeah. So when you go, you be careful what you see in museums. Some of it is fake. So that's the real death mask there. But my point is, they were an incredibly wealthy nation. If a minor pharaoh, who only reigned a few years, has a tomb with over 5,000 gold objects, you can imagine what the great pharaohs had. And yeah, Luke, and then... Yeah.
Well, it's just a side point. I know we're out of time.
That's okay.
With Tutankhamun here, he also tried to bring back gods that no one served in a while. He went back to his father, the sun, which was the sun god. That was
Right.
the main god at the time, so he was very controversial.
Right. There's a lot of weird things with the religion. But yes, sir. Go ahead.
You know, Mike, when Moses went back to Egypt to bring the people out of Egypt, if you look at today, when you went over there, today they have found cemeteries that are not far from the pyramids. And it's said now in history that when someone died building the pyramid, they built these cemeteries so that they wouldn't stop the progress of building the pyramid. So they buried them as close as they could to the pyramid.
Right.
Now I can imagine Moses seeing this and becoming angry. He saw this.
Right.
He walked around during that time and saw the kind of shaken condition that that they were working on.
Right, exactly. And we're going to talk about mud bricks in just a minute. But that's right, the labors that these people would have been under. So if you look at your timeline, it is. I know we're almost out of time. We're going to do this really quick. There's a very famous woman who acted as Pharaoh. A woman could not be Pharaoh. But this woman, when her son, Tutmosis III, he was too young to be Pharaoh, so she acted as Pharaoh, right? But that wasn't enough for her. She assumed power, and this is her tomb. And she would have lived around the time Moses was born. And some people have speculated Pharaoh's daughter, that this was Queen Hatshepsut, but no one knows for sure, because the Pharaoh probably had a lot of kids, right? But some have speculated. But what I want to point out about this woman, this is her picture. This is a monument to her. Notice she's wearing a beard, right? So a pharaoh had to be a man. So she wore a fake beard to act when she was acting as pharaoh. And so this is true. This is historical. And what I wanted, and so we're almost out of time, but I just want to notice Hebrews 11:24-26, when it says Moses refused to be called her son, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than all the treasures of Egypt. That's why I mentioned about Tutankhamun. The riches that Moses would have been exposed to are unimaginable to us, how wealthy they were. And so when Moses gave that up to be considered a slave, it's very difficult for us to understand just how much he gave up, whether or not Hatshepsut was his mother or not. This is an obelisk of Queen Hatshepsut. It's thought of like a ray of the sun. What makes this amazing is that this is a solid block of granite. It weighed, more than those stones of the pyramid. So the very fact that they carved this by hand, but then how did they transport it? And how did they even stand it upright? This is a truly engineering marvel. Now, what does this look like? Really quick. The Washington Monument. The Washington Monument is based on this. So the next time you see the Washington Monument, think about that it's really based on a monument to a woman who wore a beard and acted as Pharaoh. So that's where it comes from. All right. So I think we're going to stop here, but what we're going to do now is talk about some of the temples. Almost where I wanted to be to. This is the Temple of Karnak that was built over centuries, about 1,200 years, about 30 places, 30 different pharaohs. But what I want to notice is the temples were the places of learning, okay? And we're out of time, but I want you to remember that, because remember, Moses was taught in all the ways of the Egyptians, right? So he would have been taught in the temples. And with that, we'll stop. Thank you for your attention.